Hello, and thanks for having me today in this a little bit unusual format. So I would like to present to you a comparative analysis of state-mandated internet access blocking in France and Germany today. Due to time constraints, I will skip most of the literature discussion and just refer you to the paper, which is much more detailed, as I'll be mainly focusing on the findings in this presentation. So the starting point of this research is really that internet blocking and filtering has become a global norm. It's really not an exception anymore. It's something that is considered as problematic in terms of democratic principles and also in terms of practical implementation by most scholars. And also it's mainly researched in authoritarian regimes like China or Iran, etc., with very little focus on what is actually going on in liberal democracies. But we do actually have evidence that there is a quite broad range of internet blocking and filtering initiatives happening in liberal democracies. And here are just a few examples, and please again go and look at the paper if you want more details on this, because here we'll mainly be focusing on two internet blocking bills of child abuse images, or often also called child pornography, in Germany, the Access Impediment Act, which was adopted in 2009, and in France, the LOPSI 2 bill, which was adopted in 2011. So from a theoretical background, I'm mainly focused on political discourse networks, and my research is also informed by previous studies that basically focus on the importance of discourse coalition in shaping political actions. And the question I would like to answer today is basically to figure out how opponents of internet blocking can successfully or not challenge the pro-blocking frames advanced by power elites and put forward their own alternative frames. And here I particularly draw on Leifeld and Horns and their characteristics of successful discourse coalitions, such as the fact that they need to have a large constituency, that they need to be more dominant on the core frames of a conflict, that they need to be quite coherent internally, present a consistent storyline, present a broad enough array of frames, but also not too diverse, and also be somehow stable over time. So I'm using, and again, the message, there's more details in the paper, but I'm referring to a tool I'm using a tool developed by Philipp Leifeld, which is called the Discourse Network Analysis. And it's basically a combination of social network analysis with computer-assisted qualitative content analysis that allows to basically focus not only on the frames and discourses, but also on the actors. And in this particular case, I want to present or basically concentrate myself on congruence networks that basically establish a link between two actors that refer to a same frame, as you can see here in the graph below. So just on the material that was coded, it was based on the media debate in both countries, referring to both bills. The media debate in the main quality press in France and Germany. And here we can already see just by the number of articles that it was much more heavily discussed in Germany than in France. And this is also something like the main first finding. Here you see Germany, the number of statements referring to the internet blocking bill in Germany. We can see that it's over time much higher in Germany than in France, but that also both debates happened more or less at the same time. Also, what is important in the case of Germany is that the opponents, the people who were opposing internet blocking, were very successful in finally getting the bill revoked, which was not the case in France. So first of all, I would like to focus on Germany and just present you a brief timeline on how the debate evolved. So the first peak in the debate was when in April 2009, the then ruling Christian Democrat coalition, which was a coalition with the Social Democrats, basically made an agreement between the main ISPs and the government to start blocking child pornographic material. This was very contested in Germany, as we will see in the frame analysis, by notably the coalition partners, the Social Democrats, but also by ISPs and civil society voices, who questioned the legitimacy and constitutionality of such a measure, and basically forcing the Christian Democrats to propose a bill that would legally underpin the arrangement. And this bill was adopted in June, on June 18th, so very fast. The time frame of only 4 months between when the bill was proposed and when it was adopted can also be explained by the fact that there were the elections coming up in September 2009, where then we had a change in the coalition, which is quite important because instead of the Social Democrats, the Liberal Party became the coalition partner of the Christian Democrats, and the Liberal Democrats had put it as a campaign promise basically to not implement the blocking provision, and this was basically the case. So we actually were then, after the elections, in the quite paradoxical situation that the bill was formally adopted, but not implemented. So finally the debate rebounced again, while the bill was still implemented, everything, in February, March, when there was a complaint in front of the Constitutional Court that didn't go any really much further, but also where there was a EU proposal of a directive combating child abuse that also contained provisions to introduce a European-wide internet blocking mandate. And here actually, contrary to the position of Germany in April 2009, so just a year before, Germany was in that directive one of the most fervent opponents of mandatory internet blocking. And also finally in December 2011, this bill was formally revoked in Germany. And here we can now see the networks of opponents in red and of proponents in blue. And we can see that already looking at both, there seem to be more red ones, so more densely connected nodes. You can see it a bit bigger here. This is the opponents network, where we had 81 different type of actors that pronounced more statements, so there was really much more present in the media than the proponents network. They were more densely connected also, with mainly civil society organizations being part of this cluster, or being very central in this cluster. Whereas on the proponent side, we can see in the center, we mainly have the governments, we have the ruling parties, we have the Ministry for Justice, different types of ministry, also the European Commission, and the German police. And in both networks, we can see that actually internet service providers were quite present in both networks, and this has to do with the fact that they basically kind of switched side a bit and pronounced statements in favor and against internet blocking. Actually on an equal number of times. And this is why we also find them more at the edge of the networks. So in terms of the frames, here we can very clearly see, again in red it's the opponents, in blue it's the proponents. You can clearly see that the opponents dominated most frames of the conflict, in particular the frames of effectiveness, by arguing that internet blocking wasn't an effective measure to combat child abuse, and that there were actually better alternatives. And this was quite a very important frame under the slogan "Remove, not block." They argued that removing the content was much better than actually blocking it. So this was more the practical side of the debate, but they also dominated most frames that were concerned with more principled arguments, such as questions whether it was compatible with the German constitution and with civil liberties in general. And on the side of the proponents, we could see that they only dominated two frames: necessary measure and type of regulation. Necessary measure, arguing that it was really necessary to implement internet blocking to save children, but that this was not, they were not very, they were only slightly more dominant than the opponents. And actually, the frame type of regulations, this refers to what type of regulation would be the most effective to implement internet blocking. So would it be self-regulation with this contract with the providers, or would it be something else, legislation, etc. They were internally divided, with lots of discussions going on here. So finally, in terms of frame alignment, here we can again see both networks, and how here not the actors are related, but the frames. And here we can see that in terms of the frames mobilized by the opponents, those are all, except one, the data retention, which was a little minor one, so we're all quite neatly connected to one another, while the ones for the proponents were quite well connected, but not as well as the ones in Germany. In terms of congruence over time, we can also see that here very clearly, in terms of the clustering, the numbers of actors that were connected to each other, there was a strong increase of the opponents in the last part of the debate, much contrary to what has happened with the proponents network. And now if we compare this to what has happened in France, we can see that the blocking measures were introduced at a similar time than in Germany, namely in March 2009, as provisions included in the so-called LOPSI II bill, which was a much broader bill that focused on a whole range of security issues and mandated a general extension of surveillance and police competences in the online realm. The legislative process lasted, however, much longer in France, notably because of the record number of controversial provisions included in the bill. And the debate peaked with the vote of the National Assembly in February 2010. And once again, the bill was formally adopted and eventually censored by the Constitutional Council in March 2011. But the Council did not censor the internet blocking provisions in France. Also, they still have not been implemented, also not with the change of the government last year. So similarly to Germany, we can see in France also that the opponents network is more visible in the media. You can see it here with actually two main actors. So that's the two big black dots. On the one side, La Quadrature du Net, which is a digital rights organization, and then the more left-wing quality newspaper Libération, which were quite vocal in this debate. But also a whole range of other actors. And here we can see the proponents network, much less actors, but three quite important ones. On the one side, the right-wing UMP party that was also having the majority in the government. But also very importantly, the Fédération Française de Télécom, which is basically the telecommunication industry representative that was also very much in favor of internet blocking. And similarly to Germany, the ISPs were also in France divided, with some openly arguing in favor of blocking and others not. In terms of the frames, we can see that more or less the same type of frames were discussed also in France, but that only two really reached more visibility. On the one side, the effectiveness frame, which was dominated by the opponents, and on the other side, the constitutionality frame, which was dominated by the proponents. So here we can see that the opponents did not strongly dominate really both core aspects of the debate. Also in terms of frame alignment, this is quite interesting how we can see it. Actually, the opponents' frames were quite neatly aligned one to another, but not the main frame. The effectiveness frame was a little bit isolated and very far away from the alternative frames, contrary to what we could have observed in Germany. Whereas from the proponents one, the constitutionality one was pretty much the central frame and more or less well aligned with all the others. And looking over time, we can also see that none of them was really stable, but clearly a decrease of the opponents network. And actually a proponents network that was very strong and very strong at the beginning and at the end of the debate, also not in the middle. So just to basically conclude, what we can remember from both cases is that we can see that also in both cases the opponents were more dominant than the proponents. There exist important differences in terms of the network structures observed in both cases. So the German opponents were successful in questioning that access blocking is necessary to save children frame, put forward by the governing coalition, by arguing not only that access blocking wasn't an effective measure, as it could be easily circumvented, but by also putting forward an alternative frame, remove not block, which has since become the leitmotif of all political parties on this issue. And they successfully presented a broad but not too diverse set of frames and gained in cohesion and approval over time, meaning that more and more actors joined their frames over time. While in France, the opposition was more vocal, but not as broad in terms of number and diversity of actors as in Germany. And actually in France, important actors such as the telecommunication industry supported the government in their proposal, And most importantly, the opponents did not succeed to impose their framing on the issue, namely that access blocking was ineffective as no alternative framing made it into the press. And the proponents dominated clearly the debate on whether internet blocking without prior judicial review was proportionate and compatible with French constitutional and legal principles. So the proponents were more densely connected at the beginning and the end of the debate as well. So to conclude, we can say that looking at the network characteristics of discourse coalitions on this type of policy issues really allows to systematically analyze the similarities and differences between media debates and combine a focus on actors as well as frames and trace their evolution over time. And I'd be happy to answer a question if there are any. Thank you for your attention.